Hello, everyone. This is Karen Cox. I'm coming to you from Kentucky, where it is a beautiful spring day, and I hope you all are well where you are. This is a recording of a presentation of a Zoom meeting that I did earlier today, which was wild and crazy, for me anyway. And I just wanted to sort of put this up so that people could get the information. I did make a few changes a little bit. I brought out some of people had asked me a little bit about some of my notes and things like that. So I did bring those up, try to find those and bring those so we could talk a little bit about those in this presentation. First of all, I want to say thank you to Bianca from drunkausten.com who organized this virtual Jane Con where we could all get together and talk about our favorite thing, which is Jane Austen. Also, I wanted to say thank you to everyone who came today. It was full to capacity. I did not expect that. And so I'm very grateful for everyone who stayed, everyone who was patient, everyone who coached me through the technological glitches that we had. Because this is sort of new to me. I sort of said that I was a Zoom toddler. I know a little bit, just enough to be dangerous. So I really appreciate you all being patient and gracious with me today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and sort of share my presentation, and then I'll talk a little bit about the questions that came up afterwards. Let's go ahead and play that from the start. Okay. There's my little graphic, my little welcome graphic. And I started the presentation today by talking about Ecclesiastes, chapter 1, verse 9, because I think it's appropriate for when we talk about variations and adaptations and the creativity that goes along with that. It's from Ecclesiastes, and it says, "What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun." So adaptation is something that's really pretty much everywhere, in movies, in print, in digital media. There's some examples there on the picture graphic. "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" March, which is based on the Father and Little Women, of course, the new Little Women, the new Emma, the new Sanditon, other kinds of things like West Side Story, Broadway and film, and Romeo and Juliet, Sonia Kamal's Unmarriageable, lots of different examples of adaptations. I think in film, adaptation has become a popular trend because there's so much financial risk. So if you have an adaptation, you have sort of a built-in audience. And in a way, I think that adaptation is sort of the essence of creativity. So it's taking something that's familiar and then tweaking it a little bit and adding a new element to it, which is what a lot of our Jane Austen fan fiction or Austen-inspired fiction is. And it's sort of the creative process at work. Because Jane Austen's work is very popular and also and brilliant, and also in the public domain, her work is ripe for adaptations and variations. So there's some debate on when this paraliterature began. I have read that some of the first ones started in the 1920s, but it sort of exploded since the 1995 BBC miniseries, the one with Colin Firth. The Emma Thompson screenplay written for Sense and Sensibility, I think, also came out that year. And then, of course, we have the Hollywood Pride and Prejudice movie that came out in 2005. And 25 years later, we seem to still be going strong with more stories and books and movie adaptations, TV adaptations than ever before. Thousands of books. Even more unpublished stories, something for every taste. So one of my favorite Austen-esque bloggers is Meredith Esparza. She and I go back a long way. back to when I first started publishing books. And she has described subgenres as a way to sort of categorize and organize Austen paraliterature. And even though I know this is probably somewhat of a subjective classification, it's helpful to me because it sort of helps me sort stories in my head and helps me communicate with other people about them. The first is a variation. So that would be a variation is where a story takes a turn off course or off canon. So for example, Mr. Bennet dies while Elizabeth is at Hunsford, or Mr. Darcy is a widower, or Elizabeth isn't Bennet, or the Meryton Assembly remark isn't made or isn't heard. So some examples, and I brought some that I can show you sort of at the end of the presentation, but some examples might be, for example, Rainy Days, which is by Laurie Lillian, Nefarious, which is by Nicole Clarkston, The Journey Home to Pemberley by Joanna Starnes, and Speechless by Jessie Lewis. So those are sort of some examples of some variations. The second type of Austen-inspired adaptation is a retelling. And a retelling is a story that takes place outside of Jane Austen's original setting or time, and it may or may not follow all of the canon events. And that includes other eras, contemporary retellings, paranormals, steampunk, etc. Things like Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies, Eligible, which came out a couple of years ago, Longbourn's Songbird by Bo North, The Trials of the Honorable F Darcy by Sarah Angelini, and then my own Undeceived, which is a Pride and Prejudice in the Cold War era spy novel. The third type of adaptation would be a sequel, and one example that most of us in this genre know is Mr. Darcy Takes a Wife, which is by Linda Birdall. And then last, we have point of view shifts. So this is where you take a different character's perspective. For example, Mr. Darcy's Diary by Amanda Grange, or Charlotte Collins by Jennifer Becton, or Longbourn by Joe Baker, which was a traditionally published book that came out a couple of years ago from the view of the servants at Longbourn. So as a reader, I really enjoy all of these subgenres, but as an author, I tend to write retellings, especially those in other eras. I really sort of prefer 20th century. I like that a lot because I feel like a lot of went on during the 20th century. But I have dabbled a little bit in point of view shifts. For example, in one of my short stories, the short story that I wrote for Dangerous to Know, I wrote some of the events of Emma from the view of Frank Churchill. And then also in the Rational Creatures anthology, I did some of the events of Northanger Abbey from the viewpoint of Eleanor Tilney. So I sort of have this Southern Austen series that, like 1932 is Pride and Prejudice revisited during the Great Depression in the South. Find Wonder in All Things is sort of a Persuasion in the South in the 1990s. And then I Could Write a Book is my Emma retelling in the 1970s in horse country here in Kentucky. So for me, writing retellings grew out of my love for Jane Austen. Unlike a lot of people, I didn't read Jane Austen in high school. I didn't read Pride and Prejudice in high school. I came to her novels pretty late when I was in my 30s, after I saw the Ang Lee's movie adaptation of Sense and Sensibility. Afterwards, I read the novel and I liked it okay, but not as much as I thought I would. So later on, I thought I'm going to try Jane Austen again. And this time I thought I would start with the most popular novel, which was Pride and Prejudice, and then I was hooked after that. So what intrigued me the most as I made my way through the Austen Canon, what we call the Austen Canon, the original works, is how the stories explored psychological truths that are still relevant today. Each of her novels sort of spoke a different theme to me. If I distilled them down to one sort of take-home message, it was always something I could relate to my own life. So, for example, Pride and Prejudice sort of the main take-home theme for that is first impressions are often erroneous. For Persuasion, I feel like there's sort of three themes going on there. The theme of forgiveness, the theme of second chances, and then the importance of timing in relationships. And then for Mansfield Park, I think kind of the main theme there is integrity, and what is good isn't always appealing on the surface, and what is appealing is not always good. Okay, so that's, as I went through Austen's original works for the first time, that was kind of what I gleaned from them. But I think that a lot of times modern readers resist tackling the density of that 18th century prose. It was hard for me to sort of parse through it. It's a challenge for us for a lot of reasons here in the 21st century. One is the sentence structure is, somewhat different than what we're used to reading. The writing conventions are different. Even some of the vocabulary's changed meaning over time, and you sort of have to sort through that a little bit. But I think that why we still read her is that the characters and the themes that she explores are timeless. And I think that a reader might attempt those other reading Austen, the original Austen, like I did, if the story intrigued them enough. So writing retellings for me in other eras sort of helped me bridge that from my own life and times to Austen's. And I wanted to share those connections that I made to her work with other people. And so that was what was fun to me about it. That was why I first started wanting to do it. So that's the joy for me of adapting Austen. But there are also challenges to adapting Austen. Because when you change the time and place, that will affect the character's behavior, even if the character traits like Elizabeth's prejudice or Darcy's pride or Wickham's duplicity, even if those things remain. For example, in my 1932 novel, one of the things I wanted to explore was how Elizabeth's behavior might have changed if she had really been in precarious circumstances, and how would her character arc or the resolution of her tendency for pride and for prejudice, how would that develop as a result of that danger? And then a secondary question was, if Darcy had lived in a different time and place, and if he had had different constraints on his life, would he have approached Elizabeth the same way? So I postulated that the changes in family obligations and in the society around him, what was happening during the Great Depression and watching his neighbors go through that financial and societal upheaval, that would soften his proud edges a little bit, but that he would still think he was the smartest person in the room. Another example was when I wrote Find Wonder in All Things, which is a Persuasion adaptation, and it was my sophomore effort. And the major themes, as I talked about before, that I sort of addressed were forgiveness, second chances, and timing. So in Persuasion, as far as forgiveness, Wentworth forgives Anne for rejecting him, and Anne forgives Wentworth for his callous treatment of her when he returns, and then each of them express forgiveness for Lady Russell for her erroneous advice. As far as second chances, here the theme I wanted was to stress that second chances have to be taken by both people in order for them to work. And then the final theme was timing. And I think that Austen could see that a marriage between a young Wentworth and Anne might have been a disaster. It might have gone awry in some way. But I think that their love is different and more mature and maybe even better because they're older. And another important piece of timing, I feel like in Persuasion, is that Wentworth happens to return at about the same time that William Elliot starts to seek his reconciliation with Sir Walter and become interested in Anne. And I think giving Captain Wentworth some competition, like there's somebody else who's interested in her, I think it changes her, but I also think it changes him because he's sort of thinking, there's something that that somebody else wants that he wants. He didn't realize he wanted it until he wanted it. So somebody else wanted it. So those are the kind of themes that are timeless, truths about humanity, and Austen was a genius at writing about those. But they're still relevant today. They're going to be relevant forever because that's the way human beings are. Okay, but here's the challenge with Persuasion. Anne Elliot is an 18th century girl. Her society discourages her from expressing her feelings to Wentworth the way a modern woman would. She's sort of this Cinderella with this bad family and this flawed fairy godmother in the form of Lady Russell. Her upbringing sort of dictates that she needs to be passive, but from a modern reader's perspective, that could make her seem pathetic rather than sympathetic to a modern reader. So I had to figure out how I was going to address that. I addressed Anne's passivity by changing, my character's name was Laurel, by changing Laurel's life from being driven by the macrocosm of society, so it's not so much about society telling her what she can and can't do, but I changed that to her being influenced more by the microcosm of her personality. So her choices, her family dynamics, her profession. She's a potter, so she works alone. So I sort of made her passivity be not so much about who she was in society, but who she was as a person, interpersonally. I also had to make it easy for her to idolize her Wentworth, who in this book, in Find Wonder in All Things, his name is James Marshall, by making him a romantic, dashing, sexy guy, and then keeping her in isolation, basically, until, and for all those ensuing years until he returns. I also had to make him unsuitable in her family's eyes. So we don't have the same kinds of 18th century English class divisions. So I did two things to make him, quote, dangerous to the Elliots. One was I made him a musician, because what man is more dangerous to your daughter than a musician, right? And then I also chose education level as a great divide between the Elliots' values and James's priorities. They value education very much. Laurel also values education very much. And James, at least for part of the book, is a college dropout. So those were the two things that I adapted to try and make him seem unsuitable in the same way that Wentworth is unsuitable in the 19th century. Finally, I had to sort of tweak Lady Russell's advice to the Anne character, to Laurel. It had to be faulty to our modern eyes and based on what would be recently outdated views of male and female relationships, but not too outdated, not too much, because then it wouldn't fit the story's time frame. So I had to kind of fiddle with that a little bit and see what would work with that. Okay, so my nuts and bolts procedure, I guess, for adapting Austen is I want to write adaptations that pay homage to her themes and characters, but yet still engage a modern reader. So this is sort of the way I go about doing that. Generally, I start with a character sketch, a modern character sketch. I try to put defining characteristics in there, appearances, occupations, schooling, middle names, pets, hobbies, birthdays, childhood traumas, personality strengths and weaknesses, of course. And then I study and I take notes on the novel that I'm adapting chapter by chapter. And while I do this, I also create a timeline of the plot and the events that drive that story. So I actually go through the novel and take notes, on each chapter and what I think is driving the story in those chapters. And then I have to make some decisions. So what would those events look like in the setting that I've chosen, in the time that I've chosen? Which ones don't make sense? To drive the story, which ones don't make sense anymore? Can I adapt those plot points? Or is it something that needs to take a back seat, maybe to focus on another theme? Or do I need to just take it out completely? And then finally, I walk my characters, my modern characters, through the plot points and adjust those as I need. Sort of like viewing a movie with a pause function. And what I'm trying to do is keep fidelity to both the character and their growth arc, and also to the new setting at the same time. So I sort of watch them walk through it, and then when I see something interesting that they're doing, I'll stop the movie and sort of interview them. What are you thinking right now? What do you think is going to happen next? And then sometimes they say really crazy things because characters do that. It sometimes surprises me, which that seems kind of odd given that they're in my head, but there you have it. So a lot of times people will ask me what they think, what I think makes a successful adaptation. And sort of my idea that I always have in the back of my mind when I'm writing adaptations is to try, and I think that for an adaptation to be successful, they tend to keep the character traits and the character's growth arc intact, but they change the world around them in a realistic way that's realistic to the setting. Because Jane Austen's characters are iconic, they adapt well when you step into another time or place, and it's fun to watch her beloved Elizabeth, or the mysterious Mr. Darcy, or the hated Willoughby, or horrid Mrs. Norris walk their way through uncharted territory. So it's fun to read, and it's fun to write. Okay. So I was asked for a lot of the questions today during the Zoom meet were about Undeceived, which is and that surprised me a little bit. It was re-released last year, 2019, and it's sort of the subtitle or whatever is Pride and Prejudice in the Spy Game, and it takes place during the Cold War. And sort of the mystery is that there's a mole in the CIA, and that Mr. Darcy is suspected of being the mole, and Elizabeth Bennet is the rookie who's supposed to investigate him. It has some twists and turns along the way. I had a lot of questions about what I used, how I decided. Did I decide to do a spy story mashup with Pride and Prejudice? And my answer to that question was yes. In that case, that's exactly what I did. And it was under my husband gave that as a possibility. He likes to say it was his idea, but then when I would ask him questions about it, he would say, well, I don't know how to do that. You're the writer, you figure it out. But anyway, I do have a Pinterest board that has several lists of resources and things that I use that seem to be something that people were really interested in. So I went ahead and gave you the link to that. From those that are there, from the ones that are there, these are the starred ones, are the ones that I feel like I really use the very most. I used the book Molehunt, which was by David Wise. I also used A Short Course in the Secret War a lot, which is by Christopher Felix, and it's a nonfiction book actually about, and you'll see there's stuff in there about Hungary. So that was one thing that sort of fed my imagination as far as setting part of the book in Hungary. Another resource that I found really valuable was The Lost World of Communism, which is a BBC documentary on YouTube. There's a movie that came out, I think it has subtitles, called The Lives of Others, and that was about East Germany. That was very useful to me. It was interesting to watch movies and things like that while I was researching, because I would watch it once and then I would go back and I would notice things and see how things might sort of feed my story a little bit. It was and things like details. I mean, one of the questions today, the question that Elaine asked me about, did you go to Europe, to do this research? And boy, I wish I could have, but I didn't. I wasn't able to do that. In fact, the only time I went to Europe, I've been to Europe in my life, was when I went to England at the end of 2015. That was right before the first edition of Undeceived came out. So I did a lot of this, this sort of virtual research. But I mean, it made me want to go, but I haven't been able to go. And then the other one was body trauma. which a writer's guide to wounds and injuries. And that was actually very useful. I also had a book on violence too, for writers that I also used for that. Okay, I'm going to leave this here for just a second. This is sort of my information, you know, where my email and my social media and my website is there. And then I'm going to stop sharing the screen and show you some of the books. People have asked me to list some of those books that I listed. I don't have print versions of all of them, but and there's no way I could tell you all my favorites. I have so many favorites, but these are just a few that I've been able to sort of scare up this afternoon. So I will stop this sharing and show you some of these. This is Molehunt by David Wise, and it's the story of the Angleton. I think they finally apprehended him in '84. Okay, this is the body trauma book. I had mentioned a novel, the Le Carre, and I learned how to say that name. Thank you very much. Book. I sort of skimmed through that one, but the one that I was really thinking about was DeMille's. Not DeMille's. Where is it? I put it somewhere. Charm School. Here it is. No, that's not it. The Charm School is the one I was thinking of, that I read. Actually, I'm a speech pathologist. One of my clients' mothers pointed me toward that book when I told her I was writing a spy story. This is the short course in the Secret War by Christopher Felix. That's a nonfiction book about spycraft. I took a lot from that. And this is the Undeceived book, the second edition that came out of all that research. That book took me a long, long time to write. Trying to think what else people asked me. I did sort of pull out a couple of Jane Austen-ish books, resources that I found helpful, or things that I enjoyed about Jane Austen herself. One thing that I found really helpful are these annotated editions. When I started dabbling in Regency, the first thing I wrote that was Regency was a short story in the Dangerous to Know anthology, the one about Frank Churchill. And I was kind of at a loss a little bit because I'd not written Regency for publication before. So these annotated versions have helped me a lot. David Shepard is the editor and the annotator. There's one for Emma. I think there's one for each book. I know there's one for Pride and Prejudice and one for Emma because I've used those extensively. Here's Dr. Lucer's book, The Making of Jane Austen, for those who are interested. It's a good book that talks about this phenomenon that we're all a part of. Also, just for fun, there's LaFace, Jane Austen Letters. Lucy Worsley's Jane Austen at Home. I also have a couple of coffee table books, like picture books that are really beautiful by like At Home with Jane Austen or Tea with Jane Austen. I can't remember the title, but Kim Wilson is the author. And I saw her speak once a couple years ago, and she was a lovely speaker and a lovely lady, and her books are lovely too. So. And then here's the biography of Jane Austen by Claire Tomalin. Okay, so as far as some of my books that I have read over the year, I can't find my copy of Mr. Darcy Takes a Wife. I don't know where that is, but here's one, Remembrance of the Past by Lori Lillian. I don't even know if that's the correct version. This may be his first edition. I don't even know if the cover looks like this anymore. I mentioned Pamela Aden, her trilogy, From Mr. Darcy's Point of View, A Point of View Shift. There's that one. Here's The Trials of the Honorable F Darcy. That's a modern, little on the steamy side. Love it. I love that. I love the unpublished version too. It was wonderful. I bet I've read this one 20 times. This is Jan Hahn's An Arranged Marriage. I love that forced marriage scenario. It's like catnip to me. Here's Longbourn by Joe Baker. I liked Longbourn. I didn't love it. I thought it's sort of, you know, the pacing or whatever didn't always keep me interested, but I did like it quite a bit. It was a real interesting take. Here's Shannon Hale's Austenland, very fun. Here's Amanda Gray. We talked a little bit about point of view shifts. There's Mr. Darcy's Diary by Amanda Grange. So those are just, like I said, a very small sample. I have, of course, tons of others that are on my Kindle as well. And I know that if I start naming favorites, I'm going to be here forever thinking, oh, and then there's that one. Oh, and then there's that one. I don't want to do that to you. All right. So I'll do my little shameless self-plug, and then I will be out of here. These are sort of my Southern Austen series. So 1932 is Pride and Prejudice, revisited in the Great Depression in Southern Kentucky. And then Persuasion is 1990s. Because it was Austen's last book, I sort of set it in a later decade. And that takes place in Kentucky as well, for sort of 1990s to 2000. And then this is I Could Write a Book, which is an Emma adaptation. And because Emma was published kind of in the middle, I chose a decade sort of in the middle, and that was the 1970s. Someone asked me today if what I thought the themes were in Emma and Sense and Sensibility, and my answer was that for Emma, I think it's a lot of it is you're just not as smart as you think you are, even if your intentions are good, which is, I don't know, that's pretty obvious, I guess, if you've watched the movie or read, watched the movies or read the books. For Sense and Sensibility, I've not written that book, so I haven't really explored it that much, but I think that a lot of it has to do with balance with, Eleanor's very staid and very private and very, and I'm an Eleanor, so I really relate to her a lot. And then she has the sister, Marianne, who is, very ebullient and sensitive, and, her feelings, she wears her heart on her sleeve. And that each of them, over the course of that over the course of that novel, tend to come together. They tend to see, even though they're very different people, they tend to learn how to value the different characteristics in each other. So I think if I had to narrow that one down to one theme, that's what it would be. I haven't really thought about Northanger Abbey that much. It's such a different book than the other books. But all right. So my latest contribution to the Austen world is my 1980s story called Resistive Currents, that's in the Elizabeth Obstinate Headstrong Girl anthology. And my character, my Elizabeth in there, is Beth Bennett. There's her little thing, who is a female electrical engineering student in the 1980s, at a time when it was not very common. I mean, it's still not really common, but it was not very common at all at that time, and how she could be an obstinate, headstrong girl then. I'm trying to think if there were any other questions. I can't think of anything right off the top of my head. I appreciate you all listening, hanging with me through all this. And I'm going to post this up on YouTube, on my YouTube channel. And I may try to open the meeting again at some point. Bianca's going to let me know if there's any other slots available. I know that the weekend is full. So, but perhaps we can do this again soon. I really appreciate your attention, and I will talk to you later.